Now, there's that moment when you have your first child, and it's an interesting, scary moment. And when Adam was born, we made this, which is a little cricket bat with his name on it, with all of his middle names and his date of birth, and we framed it. It's a lovely frame, and it goes up in the living room. It's great for remembering when your children's birthdays are, but it's marking a moment. And then 4 and a bit years later, Emily came along, and we thought, well, we've got to make her a cricket bat as well. You know, and I love my cricket, so, you know, it's one of those. But again, her name, date of birth goes up in the living room. We marked a moment. And in this passage that we're about to look at today, there seems to be some suggestion that Jesus says we should all be childish. Now, I'm not going to lie, I've been accused sometimes of being childish, and I can't think at all why I would be considered to be childish. Remind you of anyone? So I know that the subject of sort of children and families can be a bit sensitive, so let's just acknowledge that. You know, I know people who struggle to have children, or can't have children at all. I know some children who have issues with their parents. I know some parents who struggle with their children. It's a complicated subject, and it's worth acknowledging that at this point. But Jesus does do that moment here where he takes a child. So for us to understand a little bit of that, I think we probably need to try and get out of our modern mindset and try and find a mindset in what we call the ancient Near East. The disciples were indeed asking questions about greatness. And if you look at Mark's account, they seem to be asking about their own greatness. How can they be greater than the other disciples? But they've just seen this moment, this miracle where Jesus has sent them to catch a fish, and inside the fish's mouth was a coin. And that made them think about Caesar and Jesus, and maybe they were thinking about different sorts of greatness. They seem to be angling here, positioning themselves to see who will become the greatest under Jesus, under Caesar. They're puffing themselves up a bit. So in this moment when the disciples are puffing themselves up, feeling really important, Jesus calls forth a child and places this child in the middle of the group. Now, in Greek culture in particular, children were seen as sort of half human. You know, they were not formed yet, they weren't useful, they weren't contributing. In fact, the Greek word for child is not feminine or masculine, but neutral. And we don't often sort of get a sense of this in the English language, but in other languages there is this sense of feminine, masculine and neutral. A child being neutral kind of makes it more like an it rather than a person. And you might say, well, that's Greek culture, but actually within Jewish culture as well, a child's place in the family there's a bit of tension there, because you know the child is potential, but they're not contributing at the moment. They're not contributing to income or position. You know, they are there, you know, hopefully to bring forth the next generation, and they get that. But within the Jewish society, a child is still seen as needy and a bit of a burden. They're not yet contributing to family.
Matthew 18 verses 1 to 5. At the time the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" He called a little child to him and placed the child among them, and he said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me."
So by taking a child, you know, possibly conceived in those cultures as a burden, not yet fully human, a work in progress maybe, Placing that child in the middle of a room and saying, be like this child. Well, by doing that, Jesus is making a really strong statement. By talking against the disciples' increasing ego, their puffed up nature, by popping their views of themselves and saying, be like this child. Jesus is reversing again, turning upside down the ways of looking at the kingdom of heaven. And yes, the kingdom word makes a reappearance here. The kingdom is full of those who, like children, have simple faith. They have potential. Humble, sometimes. We have a choice here. We can humble ourselves, be like a child, or be humiliated. Humble or humiliated. So that's really good, Emily. This passage tells me that I can be childish.
Father, it says childlike, not childish.
Well, that told me.